Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. I am Gina Ganscott, the Education Director here at the Penobscot Marine Museum. Tonight's presentation is the first in our special October speaker series featuring Penobscot Marine Museum staff. We have an exciting lineup for you this month, and I hope to see you again. I want to give a big thank you to our members and those of you who chose to donate to support our programming at Penobscot Marine Museum. More information about upcoming programs, membership, and donating can be found on our website and our Facebook page. This programming has been made possible in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities, Exploring the Human Endeavor. If you haven't already, please mute your audio and turn off your video. And if I see that it's on, I will turn it off for you. Also, we welcome questions, and those can be typed into the chat box, and you can type them whenever you think of them, and we will address them at the end. So now I'm going to turn it over to Penobscot Marine Museum photo archivist, Kevin Johnson, who is tonight's speaker.
Hello, everyone.
Oh, wait, hold on. I gotta turn the thing around, the camera around.
Touch that, and then over there on the left.
Sorry.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. I'm excited to be here to talk about one of my favorite things to talk about since I've entered this museum world, and that's postcards. Probably like many of you, I grew up with postcards, and though I didn't think too much of them other than they brought to the idea of vacations and travel, and the famous "Wish You Were Here" note on the back. We had a family friend that would always send us postcards that said, "Weather is here, wish you were beautiful." And that was a line I stole and still use on postcards that I send today. But it wasn't until I went to photography school, and then through a by chance set of circumstances, I ended up taking care of a collection of postcard negatives. Some of you may know this. And that led me to the museum, and during this past dozen plus years, I've learned so much about postcards, and I've become completely fascinated with them. So I have a lot to tell you tonight, and I'm going to start my talk with telling you a little about the history of postcards and their significance. I'm going to show you how the photographers used their cameras during the early days of postcard photography. And then I'm going to share three of our collections that are postcard-oriented collections. So, at the beginning of any talk I do about postcards, I like to start off by showing this picture to my right. Here we're seeing Mrs. R.L. Jackson's postcard shop up in St. Stephen, New Brunswick. This photo would have been taken around 1910. And it gives you a sense of what postcards were at that time. They were the absolute rage. I like to compare them to today's social media. It's very much like Twitter or Instagram. Messages are very brief. And back in this time, this was a great way of communicating. The mail was often delivered in small towns twice a day. It's an example of photography in mass culture, both in subject and in usage. And there was a lot of things going on when postcards were first introduced to the world. A lot of people were moving. The nation was shifting from a rural to an urban society. There were a record number of immigrants entering the country. And people were more apt to leave home and go on vacation. Vacation was actually a new word for normal people. And the invention of the automobile obviously turned people loose to explore the country more. So I'm going to go over a couple key dates in postcard history. In 1878, at the Paris Expo, in addition to the Eiffel Tower, the first picture postcard was introduced to the world. And it quickly made its way across the pond to the United States. And then in 1893, at the Chicago Expo, which was honoring Columbus's discovery of America, postcards were unleashed, and they were known then as private mailing cards. In 1901, the U.S. Postal Service issued order number 1447 that recognized the term postcard. And postcards were just really gaining steam then. And for an example, in 1905, 7 billion postcards were sent worldwide. In 1907 through 1908, 667 million postcards were sent, which was an average of 7 postcards per US citizen. In 1913, that number jumped up to 968 million postcards sent in the United States, nearly a billion. What makes that fact so interesting is that more than half of postcards that were purchased were never sent through the mail. They were collected. And that idea of collecting postcards took hold early. There were postcard albums that you could store them in. People often traded them. And it still is very popular today. And in fact, it's the 3rd most collected item in the world, behind stamps and coins. One other significant date is March 1st in 1907. And that's when postcards, up to this point in time, postcards could have an image on the front, but the back was reserved only for the address. And so if you wanted to include a message with your postcard, you had to write it on the front. But in 1907, due to their demand and the desire for people to write more than a little line on the front, the postcard adopted the divided back, which we're all familiar with today. There's kind of a line down the middle of the back of the postcard, and you can write your address on the right and your message on the left. So I want to start showing you some different types of postcards and as they appeared. So I mentioned the first one, which was the private mailing card, and here's an example of one. And on the back, no divided back. Clearly it states private mailing card. This would have been sent sometime in the, or made sometime in the late 1800s. After that, you'll see examples also pre-divided back, but post, when they came up with the name postcard. So here's an example. On the back, you can see, again, no divide, so only for the message. And on the front, in this particular image, which was taken in Belfast, you see this man standing next to the pilings, probably down at the steamboat launch. And it says in the old-fashioned handwriting, "The ice went out today." Another example, this one in Stockton Springs. Again, no divide. Once the divided back came, you'll see it appear like so, often having a little box up in the corner for a stamp. Now, what we're going to talk about mostly today are real photo postcards, but they were by no means the most, what was ubiquitous as a postcard during this time. Postcards were typically printed, and most often they were printed in Germany. Germany was very skilled at postcard production, and as postcards took off, so did their business. Millions of postcards were shipped over from Germany, made by American companies, but printed in Germany. Real photo postcards were used from between 1905 to the 1920s. That was their heyday. But printed postcards like the lithograph, which I just showed you, this shows the steamboat Penobscot. It's kind of a lithograph card. Between 1930 and 1945, you would have linen postcards. And I don't know if you can see the texture on this screen, but it actually looks like fabric. This is a photo of Perry's Nut House. Again, divided back. There was also the white border era, which was from 1915 to 1930. But the printed postcards and the half-cone postcards that were printed in Germany between 1907 and 1915 were considered the golden age of postcards. So let's talk a little bit now about real photo postcards. Most postcards originated with a photographic negative, and photographers used either a box camera, like you see on my left, or if you were an amateur or not producing on a mass scale, you might use a postcard camera. This is a beautiful piece of equipment made by Kodak. This slides out, you can see the bellows. These cameras took film that was actually the size of a postcard, 3.5 by 5, and this would be flexible film. And it would come on a roll, and a roll would go on one side and go across and go to another spool on the other. And the negatives they took would fit perfectly in there. If you used a box camera, like the photographers that we'll talk about later today, you typically used glass plate negatives. Box cameras came in every size. You could get small 2¼ size. This is a 4 by 5, 4 inches by 5 inches. Then the next size up would be a 5 by 7, 5 inches by 7 inches. They even had 8 by 10 cameras, and in rare circumstances, even bigger than that. They used glass plate negatives. And so if a photographer was going out to take photographs for the day, he would take his camera and his trusty wooden tripod, or sticks as it was often referred to back then, and find the image that he wanted to make, set his camera up on it. He would use the dark cloth and go underneath and cover the back and be able to look through and frame his scene. Once he got it framed, then he would take his film holder, and this would hold the 4 by 5 glass negatives. The negatives would go right in here, but this would be done before the photographer went out into the field. He'd take his film holder, it would slide into the back, and then he would expose the shutter. First, he would pull up the dark cloth, the dark slide, and that would allow the film to be exposed. Then he'd flip the dark slide over, where you can see the word exposed is nicely typed on this one. They all didn't say that. That would go back in. It's a little different than my view camera. The dark slide would go back in, obviously while it was still in the camera, and with the exposed side facing out. That's how they could tell which images had been taken. Eastern Illustrating used 5 by 7 glass plate negatives. This particular brand is the Stanley glass plates. You can see the horse is named Stanley, and the knight is saying "On Stanley, on." This film, this form of glass plate negatives were invented by the Stanley brothers of Springfield, Maine. I'm sorry, of Kingfield, Maine. You might know the Stanley brothers as inventors of the steam automobile. That was probably their most famous invention, but they made glass plate negatives that were faster than ones that were currently available. And that took off immediately to the point where Eastman Kodak purchased the technology to be able to make their own Stanley plates. And the Stanley brothers used that money from that sale to launch their car invention. Now, if we want to look down at one of these, this is an Eastern glass negative showing Main Street in Belfast. It's a beautiful scene. And now I'll show you the positive of the image. We'll see this again later in the show. I want to show it to you now for a couple purposes. First, you'll notice that this postcard is 3 inches, 3.5 by 5 inches. This was the standard size of a postcard. And the negative that they were using was 5 by 7. So you can see that every image that Eastern took was cropped, and so that the postcard was a smaller version of their original photo. Over the years, and they would reprint photographs, oftentimes the registration would be a little bit different, maybe a little bit over here, a little bit over here, or up here. So you could get different versions of the same postcard that showed more on one side or the other. If you were using one of these early Kodak postcard cameras, you would use 3.5 by 5-inch film. Here we see one of the Boston boats arriving in Northport. This negative is torn and it's flexible film, unlike the glass negatives. So these were in existence at the same time. One other thing about this Eastern negative is that I discovered this one, and you'll see that it's clearly the same image. If you turn it on the back, it says nothing about Eastern Illustrating. And so it's unclear how a company in Europe got this image and then produced this postcard. I think there was probably a little bit looser interpretation of copyright laws back then. As time went on and color took over the market, other photographers still used film to make their original images. I'm going to show you an example of one of the Phillips brothers postcard negatives. The Phillips brothers are a collection that we have at the museum, and mostly what you've heard about us talking is their maps that they would make, these decorative maps, but they were also very big in making postcards. Now, obviously, this is in the 50s or the 60s, and this scene is in Bass Harbor. And they made the kind of postcards that we would expect to find today. They're called photochromes, and they're plastic coated. They last a long time. In fact, one story that I heard from the last owner of Eastern Illustrating was that when he had placed a major order of cards and they were delivered to him in his home in Tenants Harbor, he opened the crate and the cards were out of alignment, and all of them were unusable. And he had cases and cases of them. And he said, coincidentally, he was making a new foundation for his house and had dug a big hole, and he buried them all. 20 years later, they had to excavate in that area, and they found the crates of cards and were able to open them up and pull out cards that were still as good as new, thanks to the plastic coatings. So now we're gonna, right before we do that, I wanna show you, these weren't the only type of postcards, these 3.5 by 5. There were many varieties of postcards. They came in variety of shapes and sizes. This long view, a panoramic view. If you made pictures at home with your own postcard camera, you could make cyanotype postcards, and you could buy postcard stock, generic postcard stock that was photo coated, and in your own little dark room, you could whip up a cyanotype solution and make your own postcards, and a lot of people did that. Here's yet another shape. This postcard shows the initial pieces of the Deer Isle Bridge being brought out to the causeway there. Oh, and one last one before we switch over to the slideshow. Postcards often had little ways of sending secret messages, and if you put your stamp on upside down, that was a sign of affection or love. People often even wrote in code, like Morse code, to other people. They were really, really fun to send and receive. So now let's take a look at some of these postcard collections that we have here at the museum. We're going to look at 3 today, and these are 3 different postcard makers that were all operating here in Waldo County around the same time. I don't know if they knew each other, but I suspect they must have. They often took photos of the same things, but that there was a market for these postcard makers and even others all around at the same time. So let's switch over to the slideshow part, Gina, and we'll start taking a look at first the Eastern Illustrating and Publishing Company. So here we are looking at Herman Cassens and one of his photographers, Wells Ellingwood from Winterport, on Bridge Street in Belfast. Herman Cassens was the founder of the Eastern Illustrating and Publishing Company. He's seen here in his VZ, which often appears in many postcard views. He founded the company in 1909, so it was 2 years after the divided back came onto the scene. And he had a big plan of photographing not just Waldo County and not just Maine, not even just New England, but the entire continental United States. And over 50 years that the company existed, they never pulled off that feat. But the legacy that he left behind was a thorough photograph survey of New England, with Maine obviously heavily represented. But beyond New England, he also went down to Florida, and we have many glass plates from down in Florida and places that he stopped along the way. Go on to the next slide. So Eastern Illustrating was located right in downtown Belfast. Casson's father-in-law, Edgar Hanson, owned one of the two newspapers in Belfast, the Waldo Herald. And we're pretty sure that Herman went to work for his father-in-law and learned the publishing trade. And it was in the Waldo Herald building that he started Eastern Illustrating. That building is the building behind McLeod Brothers store, if you ever go down into downtown Belfast on Bridge Street. And after they outgrew the spot that they were given there, they moved across the street, across High Street. You want to go to the next slide? To this building. It's no longer there, but for many years, this was the headquarters of Eastern Illustrating. The stories go that in their peak, they were producing more than 1 million postcards a season, and their business was primarily a warm weather season. And they often didn't have room in that building to dry out their prints. And they would wheel them across the street in racks to the Shoot and Shory garage, which is now McLeod's Furniture, where they were allowed to use one of the garage bays to dry out their cards. Most of the people that worked in the factory were women, and they worked 11-hour days. They got a half an hour for lunch, and they made $11 a week. It was primarily a family and friends of the family type business. The photographers, on the other hand, were all men, and they would leave Belfast as soon as the roads were hard enough to drive in the spring, and typically they wouldn't come back to Belfast until the fall or early winter even. And they would do most of their correspondence with the company by sending exposed plates back by train, where they'd be processed and cards made and then sent back to them wherever they were, where they could take orders, show samples, take orders, and then move on to the next town. You go to the next image, Jim. Eastern was very adamant about promoting the fact that they were using real photo postcards. They considered them to be obviously better, the best even, and emphasized the fact that because they were actual photographic prints, they had a genuine quality to them. They were more real than a lithograph portrayal of the same scene. Next slide. Now, this is not Eastern Illustrating, but this is probably what it might have looked like inside the Eastern factory. This room would have been dark, and so this picture is obviously staged and illuminated for the photo purposes, but you would have vats of chemistry. Essentially, it was a dark room, but on a large scale. They had a machine that could print postcards or expose postcards rapidly, and then those postcards were developed in batches, and they would go through the traditional wet darkroom processing. They would go into a developer bath, then they would be taken out by paddles and put into, and that's a paddle that you see going across the round thing. Yep, and they would go from the developer bath into a stop bath, which would then stop the developing. And from the stop bath, they would be paddled into a fixer, and the fixer would essentially remove all unexposed silver from the paper and fix the image. After that, it would be washed in water, and then typically, and during this early era, toned or bleached in sepia. I suspect, unfortunately, that all this chemistry ended up in Belfast Bay. You'll notice up in the upper right corner, there's a sign that says, "Don't spit." Apparently, chewing tobacco, spit would not be a good thing to add to the photochemistry. We can go on to the next slide. This is the type of machine that Eastern Illustrating would have used. It had a way of, toward the top, a way that the glass plate could be inserted and held steady. And then it could be loaded with postcard stock, which would feed a sheet of postcard stock onto the glass negative, press it against it, it would be exposed briefly to light, and then shoot out the bottom. And it was automated, so they would just hit the switch and they could go and make 25 or 50 of the same image. The dial on the side where that number 67 is probably controlled the light intensity. And photos that were overexposed or dense would need more light. Pictures that were underexposed or thin would need less light. And so they could make some adjustments, but they definitely were not individually printed. And sometimes the quality is of the postcards themselves show that. We can go on to the next. Now, in addition to making postcards, Eastern Illustrating, they would do anything. They'd make your postcards, they'd make postcard maps, they'd provide your racks, they would make enlargements, they could do hand coloring. They had their own line of comic cards and other joke cards that would be more mass produced and were not real photo, but they would offer those as well. They would go to your business, they would photograph your business, they would make your business cards, anything for $1. And for a long time, they were very successful. Go on to the next one. So here we can see that cool photo of Main Street. Notice the little boy in his Native American costume on the left side in front of what would be Chase's Daily today. And it's these kind of details that make real photo postcards so special. The negatives themselves, being large format, have incredible resolution. And everything is captured, allowing you to peer through with a magnifying glass. You see the man coming out of the post office to his bicycle. That was the post office and custom house at the time. It's still the post office. On the right, you can see the right side of Main Street. You can see the various stores. There was a drugstore that offered ice cream and cold drinks. You can see a man probably keeping a close eye on the photographer from the comfort of his carriage. There's a store that is selling postcards. Another store offering photograph and records. This particular view looks very similar to today, and not much has changed. And that's not true everywhere, as we'll see later on. Let's go to the next slide, Gina. Here we're looking at the Carver Library in Searsport. And we see the librarian, Miss Mary McClure, posing out in front. This photo, though it's part of the Eastern collection, was originally made by a Searsport photographer named M.A. Cook. Cook was German, and apparently at some point during the World Wars felt unwelcome in Searsport and decided to leave and moved all the way to Belfast. But this was one of his original negatives, and somehow his negatives have ended up in Eastern's collection. The captions that you see on the cards are actually on the negatives. And the young girls at the postcard factory would write in black washable ink on the emulsion side of the negative. Because, as you can imagine, a negative gets reversed to a positive, the writing had to be written backwards in order to be reversed and be read properly. And they were very good at it. But you can see that on occasions, like at Searsport, there's a backwards S, two backwards S's. S's and R's were particularly hard. I's and T's were not. Another cool, one more note about this library. The Carvers were very big in Searsport, and their family was one of the founding families of the museum, the Penobscot Marine Museum. So they had this library built, and not only did they pay for it to be built, but they gave the stones, which were all taken from their farm field, which is now where Moose Point State Park is. So now we can go on to the next one, Gina. Here we see the lunch counter at Penobscot Park, and I love this photo. Penobscot Park was an idea that was created by the owners of the Eastern Steamship Line and the Bangor-Aroostook Railroad. And it was a place that they kind of created to be an alternative tourist destination to Bar Harbor. And so the trains would stop there and steamboats would land at Kidder Point. They had a dance hall and a lunch counter, which is what we're looking at now. Bands would come there. They had little cabins that you could rent. Some of those cabins still exist around Searsport and are still lived in, actually. The experiment at Penobscot Park did not last too long. It maybe lasted for 15 years. But looking at a photo like this, where you can clearly see these people's faces, and some of them look like you would see them today, and others with their hairdos of the age definitely look like they're back in time. You can see the one person moved a little bit, and she's a little bit blurry. And this probably would have been a little bit of a longer exposure being inside, even though you can see the light streaming through the windows. Okay, we can go to the next one. Now here's a site that we would never see in a modern day postcard, a photo of a factory. This is the Great Northern Paper Company up in East Millinocket. Smoke billowing out of the big smoke stack. Pretty rough looking on the outside. But postcards at this time were different. And people were eager to be able to send to family members and friends from away images of where they lived and where they worked. And towns like Millinocket, where most of the population worked at the mill, this was the cornerstone of their existence. And so having pictures of factories and other industry was quite common back then. And this is one of the reasons why real photo postcards are incredible historical documents. Our modern postcards showing sunsets and pretty pictures are less so, but these were different. And they give you a really, this is what it looked like. Okay, we can go on to the next one. Here's an iconic photo. This is the steamship Belfast going under the brand new Waldo Hancock Bridge. It's November 16th, 1931, opening day of the bridge. The photographer poised and waited probably right for that exact moment for the steamboat to pass underneath. And if you look closely, you can see a parade coming across the bridge. And this was the inaugural parade. It was a big deal. In different pictures, you'll see salesmen on the side at the edge of the bridge selling postcard views of it already. And the reason that this image is significant to me is that it marks a big change in the way life was in Maine, especially during this time. It's the exiting of the steamboat era and the beginning of the automobile era. Prior to this bridge, if you wanted to cross the Penobscot River, you had to go on a car ferry that was essentially a small barge that could hold 6 or so cars on it with a small motorboat strapped to it, and it would take you across the river, and depending which way the tide was going, you may have to take a wide loop or not a wide loop to get to the other side. This opened the floodgates for people to drive to places like Acadia and the rest of the north woods for hunting and fishing and all kinds of exploration. All right, next one. Here's a neat photo down in Pemaquid. This is the Fort William Henry down at Pemaquid Point. And there's the fort, and parked right in front of it is the Eastern vehicle. And I always make a special note when they appear in the photographs. You can see a little ice cream stand there. And if you follow the wooden sidewalk up to where the photographer is standing, his appearance is also part of the image, because there's his shadow standing behind his view camera, probably the dark cloth draped over top. Okay, on to the next. Children's summer camps were a great haunt for Eastern photographers. Here they had kids that, you know, they were trapped there, and the only way they could get word to their mom and dad was to send out postcards. And if they could be postcards of themselves doing what they were doing up there, even better. These kids are dressed up as Native Americans in unity at a summer camp there. They don't seem to be too excited about having their photo taken, or maybe they're just trying to look fierce. But many of the camps throughout Maine and upstate New York and New Hampshire and Vermont were photographed by Eastern photographers. I thought I'd include a Rangeley photo because I'm heading up to Rangeley this weekend. Here we see what would have been a pretty modern motorboat cruising along in front of the Rangeley Hotel. That hotel was built originally in the late 1800s, then moved closer to the shore, expanded multiple times until it was torn down in the late 1950s. And here we see a character from Port Clyde, Eldridge Stone, with a giant lobster. Eldridge was quite the guy. He was a lobsterman, supposedly a bootlegger, did all kinds of odd jobs, one of which was house painting, and he was known to be able to walk along a roof line and simply bend over to paint the soffits underneath the roof. Didn't matter how high up the house was. And here's an example, I'd like to show you of how things have changed significantly. Here we are in Danforth, Maine, a place that I get to go up to each spring to do a little fishing with my friend who has a cottage up there. And this past year, it was too windy to go out on the lake, so I spent my time driving around looking for the old spots where Eastern photos were taken. And here was one, yet I went through Danforth multiple times without seeing any building that resembled this at all. And I stopped and talked to a woman and showed her the picture I was trying to find, and she was able to tell me exactly where it was. And if you look closely, that right corner of the building in the forefront is a concrete or granite post that was placed in the ground when Danforth became a town. And if you go to the next photo, Gina. Oop. I guess it didn't transfer over. I'm sorry, I'll have to share it at a later date. But the only thing that remains from this scene is that granite post, and everything else is completely gone. But the post is still in that same spot, has that off center just a little bit. And so it makes a quite powerful now photo, but you have to take my word for it. So we'll close out the Eastern Illustrating section with this photo, this famous photo taken in Lynchville, Maine. It's the famous signpost, I should say, that points to all the different countries that Maine towns are named after, with a little kid pretending to be a hobo, deciding where he's going to go. This was one of the modern Eastern postcards, made with a colored transparency, and it was a photochrome type card. And when we got this portion of the collection, which was semi-recently, and we put this photo out, someone got in touch with me to tell me that the boy in the photo, his name was Hank Rolfe of Albany, Maine. So what a neat thing to find out. Okay, so now we're going to look at another postcard business that was operating at the same time as Eastern Illustrating, and this is the Cunningham Brothers. The Cunningham Brothers were based out of Washington, Maine, that is. And here we see Bert Cunningham with his box camera in front of their photographic studio. Frank and Bert Cunningham were born just after the Civil War and took up photography in the very early 1900s. Washington, Maine, if you're familiar with it, is in the mid-coast inland. And all of this area of the mid-coast was primarily farming communities that were served by passenger rail trains, not directly typically, but close to it, and connected by dirt roads. And these guys went around from primarily inland, as far south as Waldoboro, up through most of Knox County, and then into Waldo County and around Montville and Searsmont and those areas. We go to the next photo. So that's Bert that we see in that photo, and here's Frank, his brother. Frank kept on being a photographer, where Bert kind of retired from it after his wife died. Coincidentally, Frank and Bert were married to sisters, Mabel and Ellen. Let's go on to the next photo. Are there no more photos? Oh, there we go. So here we see a different kids camp. This one is in Washington, Maine, the Wetona Girls Camp. And they made scores of images of this camp. But this one sticks out to me as one of them is pretending to dive in off the camp diving board. Unlike Eastern, the Cunninghams used mostly 4x5 negatives, but occasionally 5x7 and even occasionally 8x10. But they used their 4x5s to make their postcards. And they, instead of handwriting their captions, they had some type of block stencil. And so when you get one of their postcards, they look different. And often they have a bit of a white border because their postcards are slightly smaller than the 3.5x5. Here we see a store in Burkittville. Burkittville, if you're not familiar with it, is part of Appleton. At this time, it was probably just its own village, but it is currently part of Appleton. And you can see the power of a man with a camera back in this day. And I do say man because primarily they were men. But that will change, you'll see in the next group. Here we see a man with his trophy moose. I'm unsure whether this was actually turned into a postcard or just a photograph. They did both, sort of like Eastern did. And go to the next. Here's a man with a different trophy, his stringer of crappie or bream. And he's standing in front of the Cunningham's studio. On June 14th, 1907. Here's a beautiful photo. And it's remarkable because obviously they didn't just ride up into town and take out their camera and all these people were just standing there. This was choreographed, which obviously took some effort. But imagine today trying to get people from a village to all come out and pose in front of their homes or businesses like this group did in South Liberty. It's an amazing photograph. Here we see a street parade in Washington during their their centennial, not their bicentennial, their centennial, in 1911. Before the Spanish flu, so there's no social distancing going on, or masks, packed in like sardines, and no shortage of bunting. And this is the last Cunningham one that we'll look at, but this is the veterans of Waldo County all gathered together for their portrait. This incredible shot was made with an 8x10 camera and negative. The members of the band there. That was in 1922. Okay, so the last postcard photographer we'll talk about is not a man, it's a woman. Her name is Harriet Hitchborn, and she was from Stockton Springs. It was noted in her obituary that she should be remembered as an irrepressible artist with a fearless nature and a loyal heart. So she was born in Stockton Springs into a large, notable family. She was born in 1869, and her father was an accomplished shipbuilder, Nathan Griffin Hitchborn. If you go to the next slide, Gina, I think it might be he. Well, actually, this was their house. And if you've been lucky enough to get out to dinner in the past couple years and go to the Hitchborn, this is the building where it is located. And they appropriately named it after the Hitchborn family who once owned it. So Harriet's father was Nathan Griffin Hitchborn, who was a descendant of Robert Hitchborn, who was one of the original Cape Jellison settlers and a cousin of Paul Revere, no less. Harriet learned photography at some point. We'll go to the next photo, Gina. There's Nathan Griffin Hitchborn, her father, the shipbuilder, posing stoically on the side porch. So at some point, Harriet learned photography and began making photographs, primarily in Stockton and down to Cape Jellison and over to Searsport. That was kind of her haunt. But she sold her postcards in Stockton. There was one note that we found in a newspaper that noted that she was hand painting photos and postcards for a postcard photographer named Charles Townsend in Belfast. And I think that possibly he mentored her to teach her photography. He was quite accomplished and had started earlier. Anyway, she became a very accomplished photographer herself. You can go on to the next one. Her story, though, is kind of tragic. Her sister, Faustina, wrote the history of Stockton Springs. And there are some tales, and I'm not sure what is true, and I'm not sure if anyone could tell us now, but she became a recluse and was sickly. This is Faustina, and Harriet had to take care of her. And she often had her sister Faustina had a bad disposition, and it must have been unpleasant. And Harriet supposedly sought peace and quiet in the darkroom. This is a photo at Penobscot Park, which I showed a different photo from Penobscot Park taken by Eastern Illustrating. This is the Newport band, who happened to be the band that was on site the day that she was there. But imagine getting all those people to come out and pose for you. It was the novelty of the camera. Next photo. Another photo from Penobscot Park. Women and men dressed to the nines. Carriages looking out to Sears Island. I wanted to include this one because, like that Main Street photo of Belfast, where a lithograph card was made, a lithograph card was also made of this one. If we go to the next view, Gina, we see that same image, colorized, mass-produced in Germany, and no credit was given to Harriet. So whether she sold the image to them or whether they just bought one of her postcards and made it their own, I don't know. This is down at the Cape Jellison docks, and what a place that was. There were large, really long docks that went out. I believe there were 5 of them, long enough for these giant schooners and now steamships to come in and be loaded with potatoes and lumber and all other goods that Maine produced. The railroad came right down and could go down on any one of these long docks, so that loading and unloading to the ships was made very easy. It was a pretty amazing place, but there is not a single sign of it today. The entire wharf went up in a great fire in 1924. Here's a photo of a steamboat arriving at Kidder Point. These people would have been either coming or going to Penobscot Park. And this is a magical photo. Some people stopping to pose, but other people bustling by. So you have some action going on. It just feels very lively. And we're going to close out with this photo. This beautiful house was a sea captain's house in Searsport. His name was Joseph Loomis Park, and this was the Park House, and beautiful and stately in its day. And you may be familiar with it, though it definitely is fairly recognizable. So we'll go on to the last photo that shows the now version of the Park House. It's slowly being dismantled by whoever owns it now, and is in a sad state, but powerful nevertheless. So that concludes my talk, and
thanks, Kevin. Do you want to turn on your video and you can answer questions if anybody has one? I don't see any in the chat box, but if you have a question, please feel free to write it in the chat box.
Can you, it says that our video is disabled?
Oh, because I turned you off. Okay, hold on a second. We'll figure this out.
I do have a couple of last things to say before we go out anyway. So if you're interested in learning more about postcards, you can find this book probably on Amazon somewhere or in a used bookshop. It's the Mid-Coast Maine, the Cunningham collection, and it's one of the Images of America books that was written by Joseph and Jeremy Diffenbacher. Very cool book and shows a lot of the Cunningham's work. This is my favorite book about real photo postcards as we were. And most of what I've learned learned out of either that book or this book, The Real Photo Postcard Guide. I believe we have this one in our gift shop, which maybe at some point will be online. I don't know if it currently is. But one book about postcards that definitely is online is the book that I got to do with my 2 history heroes, Earl Shuttleworth, who is also a big postcard buff, and Bill Bunting, Maine on Glass. And you can order this from our shop. And it's even autographed by the 3 of us. And lastly, there's a very cool movie that has been shown on MPBN a few times called The Northeast by Eastern, which was made by Wiscasset filmmaker Sumner McCain. It's a great film. I have my first starring role in here where I'm interviewed. It was fun to do, and we have it in our shop, but you can also get it from Sumner's website. You just have to Google Sumner McCain to find it. So if you don't have any questions, I'd just like to thank you for tuning in tonight, and you're always free to get in touch with me about anything related to postcards or photos.
And Kevin, I do have a question for you from Carolyn. She asks, are any of the collections cataloged by subject? So if you wanted images of town bands, for example, would you just have to look through?
We do try to capture that. Our database is a work in progress, and we're constantly improving our records, but typically pretty much every image that I showed you tonight is online in our online database, and it can be searched. There's an advanced search field, and you can search in description. So if you have something like a custom house or something that, or a post office that you wanted to search for, regardless of what town, you could just put that in the description. I will caution you though, if you put something in with more than one word, like custom house, make sure that you put it in quotes, or you'll get all the records that have custom and have house, which will make searching rather painful. But you also can search by place and city and state. And we are constantly adding to our keywords so that those subject searches will be better in the future.
Thanks, Kevin. And it looks like that was the only question that I see. So thanks again for giving us a presentation, and thank you everybody else for joining us. And I hope to see some of you or all of you back next week when Matt Wheeler will be talking about Casa Rohoma and Maine's bygone log drives. So hopefully we'll see you then, and have a great evening.